In a hushed courtroom in 1996, a black man stood before hundreds of white descendants and spoke 6 words that shattered 3 centuries of silence. "I am a Livingston too." The room went cold. To acknowledge him would be to admit that one of America's founding families, the dynasty that administered the oath to George Washington, signed the Declaration of Independence, controlled more land than Rhode Island, had built their empire on rape, piracy, and a prostitution network so vast it makes modern crime families look like street hustlers. But that's just the surface. What really happened to the Livingston dynasty isn't what they taught you in history class. It's far darker, and the evidence has been buried in plain sight for 300 years. Before we owned slaves in cotton fields, before the Vanderbilts built their mansions, before the word mafia existed in America, one family perfected the art of invisible empire. They didn't just accumulate wealth, they accumulated secrets. And those secrets, they're about to destroy everything you thought you knew about America's founding. Let's go back to where it all began, not in the gleaming halls of American democracy, but in the blood-soaked battlefields of 17th century Scotland. The Livingstons weren't always American aristocrats. They were Scottish mercenaries, soldiers for hire who pledged loyalty not to country or principle, but to whoever held power. During the reign of James II in the 1400s, they attached themselves to the Stuart royal family like parasites to a host. They didn't just serve the king, they raised his children, became his most trusted confidants, positioned themselves as indispensable. This was the Livingston formula. Find power, attach yourself to it, and never let go. When James VI and I, the King James of Bible fame, entrusted his own children to Livingston care, it seemed the family had reached its peak. But then everything collapsed. The English Civil War erupted in 1642, and the Livingstons had bet everything on the wrong horse. Oliver Cromwell's forces crushed the Stuart monarchy, and the Livingston family fortune evaporated overnight. They went from raising kings to religious outcasts, embracing radical Presbyterianism that made them pariahs in Scotland. Some fled to Rotterdam, the Dutch pirate haven where religious extremists and sea raiders drank from the same cups. It was here, in the filthy port taverns of the Netherlands, that young Robert Livingston, the man who would found the American dynasty, learned the first rule of survival. When the law won't make you rich, break it. Robert left Rotterdam as a teenager and arrived in the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam with nothing but his family, its faded aristocratic name, and a hunger that would consume everything in its path. He had no land, no money, no connections, just ambition, and a complete willingness to do whatever it took. Robert Livingston understood something most colonists did not. The real money in the New World wasn't in farming or honest trade, it was in piracy. And not the romantic kind you see in movies. This was state-sponsored theft, legitimized by documents called letters of marque. In 1695, Robert crafted a business deal that would make modern crime syndicates jealous. He partnered with Captain William Kidd, a merchant sailor with a reputation for violence and a wife conveniently living under Livingston's control in New York. Together with the Earl of Bellamont, the Lord Chancellor, and even King William himself, they formed a privateer operation to suppress piracy in North American waters. Let that sink in. They were going to fight pirates by becoming pirates. Robert personally drafted the Articles of Agreement with his own hand, creating the Adventure Galley, a ship that would become notorious in the annals of maritime crime. But here's where it gets interesting. The venture wasn't really about stopping pirates. It was about eliminating competition. Robert's political enemy in New York, Colonel Fletcher, had his own network of pirates called the Red Sea Men, led by Captain Thomas Tew. The Livingston-Kidd partnership was simply a more powerful criminal network destroying a weaker one, all with the king's blessing. Captain Kidd was eventually caught, tried, and hanged. The British Crown washed its hands of the whole affair. But Robert, he walked away with the fortune, blood money transformed into land. By 1706, he had leveraged his piracy profits into something far more valuable, a royal patent for 160,000 acres along the Hudson River. Livingston Manor was born. Not from honest work, not from noble service, but from the stolen gold of merchant ships and the broken bodies of sailors left to rot in tropical waters. And this was just the foundation. The real horror was what he would build on top of it. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you don't own your land. You never did. Your grandparents farmed it. Your parents farmed it. You farmed it your entire life. But a piece of paper says it all belongs to someone else, someone who now demands payment, forever. This was the genius of Livingston Manor. It was legal slavery for white people. Robert and his descendants didn't just own land. They owned a feudal system transplanted from medieval Europe into the heart of America. Tenant farmers on Livingston Manor couldn't own property. They paid perpetual rent, generation after generation, with no hope of ever buying their freedom. They paid quarter sales, a medieval tax where the landlord took a percentage every time property changed hands. They paid fines for imaginary infractions. They were forbidden from cutting timber, mining stone, or improving their own homes without permission. If they fell behind on rent, the Livingstons could seize everything: livestock, crops, tools, even their children's labor. But here's what makes it truly diabolical. It was all perfectly legal. While the Founding Fathers were writing passionate words about liberty and freedom from tyranny, the Livingstons were operating a system more oppressive than British colonial rule. And they did it for over 150 years. By the 1700s, the Livingstons controlled more land than Rhode Island, with thousands of tenant families trapped in generational poverty. When tenants tried to organize, to demand fair leases or the right to own their land, the Livingstons responded with violence. In June 1766, 200 tenant farmers marched on the Livingston Manor House demanding free leases. They were met by armed militias, beaten back, their leaders arrested. One of those leaders? Crushed by Robert Williams, the Chancellor's brother. The message was clear. Resistance meant death or prison. And the beautiful part, for the Livingstons, is that history would barely remember it. These weren't enslaved Africans whose suffering might someday become a moral crisis. These were white farmers, and their oppression was somehow acceptable, invisible, written out of the story of American freedom. While tenant farmers starved on their upstate manors, the Livingstons were building a different kind of empire in Manhattan, one that makes The Godfather look like a children's story. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston, the man who would administer the presidential oath to George Washington, who would negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, who would be celebrated as a founding father, owned brothels. Not one, not two. Over 30 documented houses of prostitution in Lower Manhattan. His brother John R. Livingston controlled even more, with at least 5 brothels concentrated in 5 Points, the most notorious slum in American history. These weren't high-class establishments. Historical records describe children as young as 10 to 12 years old being prostituted. Girls groomed by informal networks of older prostitutes and madams who recruited family members and friends into the trade. The Livingstons were sex traffickers on an industrial scale, and they did it with complete impunity. Judges ruled in their favor. Politicians protected them. Tax records from 1820 to 1850 prove John R. Livingston owned or controlled the buildings where this horror happened, collecting rent money stained with the suffering of children. But wait, it gets worse. The Livingston brothels were deliberately interracial, designed to inflame racial tensions. Black madams ran some establishments staffed with white women. Others mixed black and white prostitutes serving mixed clientele, all in a city where racial anxieties were already explosive. Why? Because racial conflict was good for business. When immigrant laborers and free black workers were fighting each other, they weren't organizing against their landlords. They weren't demanding fair wages or better conditions. The Livingstons understood that division equals control. And here's the sickest part. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston publicly opposed slavery on moral grounds, calling it wrong to create a malignant aristocracy based on race. Meanwhile, he owned enslaved people at his upstate manor and profited from the sexual enslavement of white children in Manhattan. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. But it reveals the Livingston philosophy perfectly. Morality is for public speeches, money is for private vaults, and the suffering of the powerless is just the cost of doing business. To understand the full scope of Livingston power, you need to understand their most strategic alliance with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois or Six Nations. Robert Livingston spent years living among indigenous peoples in what is now New York State, learning their languages, their customs, their political structures. He became the British colonial government's point man for all Native American relations, eventually earning over 100 British pounds sterling a year as Secretary for Indian Affairs. But this wasn't about cultural exchange or mutual respect. This was about weaponizing human beings. The French colonial government in Canada was trying to recruit indigenous warriors to attack British settlements. Robert's job was to counter that by keeping the Haudenosaunee allied with British interests, which meant Livingston interests. He became a gatekeeper, the only person who could facilitate communication between indigenous nations and colonial administrators in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And he used that power ruthlessly. When indigenous raiding parties attacked non-Quaker settlements, particularly Scottish-Irish Presbyterians, the same religious group that had marginalized his family in Scotland, Robert conveniently looked the other way. The Quakers of Pennsylvania, who controlled enormous wealth and political power, tolerated indigenous violence as long as it targeted their religious rivals. It was ethnic cleansing by proxy, and the Livingstons facilitated it. But Robert played an even more disturbing game. He convinced the British Crown to fund military operations against French-allied tribes using his own money as loans. When the Crown couldn't pay him back, he sailed to London and demanded compensation paid in land grants. That's how Livingston Manor grew from stolen pirate gold to royal charters, by financing genocidal warfare and then demanding payment in native land. The beautiful irony? Robert had lived with these communities, spoke their languages, understood their humanity, and still sacrificed them for real estate. Some of the radical Protestants of that era believed indigenous peoples were a lost tribe of Israel, part of God's plan. Robert Livingston believed they were currency, and he spent them. In 1996, a Yale graduate named Christopher Rabb did something unthinkable. He showed up at a Livingston family reunion at Claremont State Historic Site and presented genealogical evidence that he was a direct descendant of the Livingston line, through his enslaved ancestor. The room went silent, because acknowledging Christopher Rabb meant acknowledging that a Livingston ancestor had raped a woman he held in bondage. For 28 years, the white Livingston descendants refused to officially recognize him. Not because his evidence was wrong, historians confirmed it was meticulous and accurate, but because the truth was too ugly. The Livingstons had built their image on founding father mythology, patriotism, public service, civic virtue. The reality was rape, enslavement, and children torn from their mothers. Philip Livingston, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, made his early fortune as a slave trader. His father, Robert Livingston's first major investment in 1690 was a half-interest in the Margaret, a slave ship that traveled between Madagascar, Barbados, and Virginia, trading in human beings, sugar, and tobacco. Philip and his sons continued the family tradition, building wealth on bodies shackled in shipholds. But it wasn't just labor they stole. It was children. The historical record shows multiple mixed-race children born to enslaved women on Livingston properties. Children who were never acknowledged, never freed, never given their rightful inheritance. Christopher Rabb represented all of them. Every descendant whose lineage was erased. Every child born from violence and raised in chains, while their white half-siblings inherited mansions. In 2024, 28 years after Christopher first presented his evidence, Claremont State Historic Site finally installed an exhibit acknowledging Black Livingston descendants. It took nearly 3 decades for the historical establishment to admit what everyone already knew. The Livingston Dynasty was built on the systematic rape and enslavement of black women, and the cover-up lasted 3 centuries. Because here's what the Livingstons understood better than almost any American dynasty. Image is more valuable than truth. As long as the history books call you a founding father, it doesn't matter what you actually did. In that formula, public virtue, private horror, would carry them to the pinnacle of American power. By the 1830s, something was breaking. The tenant farmers of Livingston Manor and other Hudson Valley estates had endured over 150 years of feudal oppression. Perpetual rent, medieval taxes, no hope of ownership, violent suppression of dissent. But a new generation was born that refused to accept it. They called themselves the anti-renters, and between 1839 and 1845, they launched a rebellion that would shake the foundations of New York power. Tenant farmers refused to pay rent. They dressed as Indians in disguises, attacked sheriffs trying to collect fees, burned legal documents, and tarred and feathered landlord agents. The Livingston descendants, by now scattered across multiple estates, responded with militias and murder. But something had changed in American consciousness. The revolution had happened. The Constitution promised equality. The rhetoric of freedom was everywhere, and tenant farmers started asking why that freedom didn't apply to them. Why should white Americans live under a feudal system the Founding Fathers supposedly fought to destroy? The anti-rent war was a second revolution, one that history barely remembers because it exposed the hypocrisy at America's core. The same Founding Father families who declared independence from British tyranny had created their own tyrannical system. The same men who wrote, "All men are created equal," operated feudal manners where equality was impossible. By 1846, New York State finally reformed its constitution to outlaw feudal land practices. The manor system died, not because the Livingstons developed a conscience, but because the people rose up and forced it to end. But the Livingston fortune didn't evaporate. They'd already diversified: Manhattan real estate, prostitution networks, political connections, investments in early American industry. The manors dissolved, but the dynasty adapted. They always adapted. Because the Livingston formula was never about any single source of income, it was about power. And power, once consolidated, is almost impossible to destroy. Even today, Livingston descendants occupy positions of influence across America. The family name still opens doors. The estates still exist, now tourist attractions where visitors marvel at historic grandeur without understanding the blood that paid for every brick. And the secrets? Most of them are still buried. Here's what's truly horrifying about the Livingston dynasty. They won. Not just in their own time, but in ours. Come to any American history textbook and you'll find glowing references to the Livingston family, founding fathers, patriots, public servants. Robert R. Livingston administered the oath of office to George Washington, one of the most iconic moments in American history, and that image washes away everything else. The piracy, the prostitution, the rape, the enslavement, the feudal oppression, the tenant wars, all of it gets buried under the mythology of founding father nobility. This is the Livingston endgame. Not just accumulating wealth, but controlling the narrative. They didn't need to hide their crimes. They just needed to be more famous for something else. And it worked. Claremont State Historic Site, the family's Hudson Valley estate, operates as a New York state park. Thousands of visitors tour it every year, admiring the architecture and the views of the Catskill Mountains across the river. Tour guides tell stories of American Revolution history and steamboat innovation. They mention Robert Fulton's partnership with Livingston to develop the first commercially successful steamboat. Very few mention the brothels, the enslaved people, the tenant farmers crushed under feudal law. And when those stories finally began to surface in recent years, the response from historical institutions was telling: slow acknowledgement, carefully worded exhibits, emphasis on complexity and context. Never a full reckoning. Because a full reckoning would mean admitting that American founding mythology is largely fiction. That the men we celebrate were often monsters. That the system they built was designed to concentrate power in the hands of a few families who would pass it down through generations. Accountability be damned. The Livingstons understood something crucial. If you can embed yourself in the founding story of a nation, you become untouchable. You can commit almost any crime, and historians will find ways to excuse it or ignore it. They'll focus on your achievements and treat your atrocities as unfortunate footnotes. And the beautiful thing, from the Livingston perspective, is that the model worked so well that other families copied it. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, They all learned that wealth plus mythology equals immortality. Commit crimes in private, perform virtue in public, and future generations will build museums in your honor. So what really happened to the Livingston dynasty? The answer is nothing. They didn't fall, they didn't collapse, they didn't face justice. They evolved. The manor system died, but the family survived by adapting to new forms of power: corporate law, banking, politics, academia. Livingston descendants are everywhere, many of them completely unaware of the full scope of their family's history. And that's perhaps the most disturbing part: how easily generational sin gets forgotten when you inherit comfort instead of consequences. Meanwhile, the descendants of the people the Livingstons brutalized, the tenant farmers, the enslaved people, the prostituted children, got nothing. No reparations, no inheritance, often not even acknowledgement. Christopher Rabb spent decades fighting for recognition before the historical establishment would even admit his lineage. Thousands of other descendants don't even know their connection. Their family histories erased by masters who refuse to document the children born from rape. The ghost of Livingston ideology haunts America still. We live in a country where wealth concentration has reached levels unseen since the Gilded Age, where corporate landlords buy up housing and turn homeowners into permanent renters, where trafficking networks operate with shocking impunity, where the powerful commit crimes in public and face no consequences because they've captured the institutions meant to hold them accountable. The Livingstons didn't invent this model, but they perfected it for America. And their story matters not because they were unique monsters, but because they were successful ones. They proved that in America, if you accumulate enough wealth and power, you can literally get away with murder, rape, enslavement, and theft. And 300 years later, your descendants will be respected members of society visiting historical sites that bear your name. That's not history, that's prophecy. Because the same systems that protected the Livingstons are protecting their spiritual successors today. Different names, same formula: concentrate power, exploit the vulnerable, control the narrative, and wait for time to turn your crimes into heritage. What really happened to the Livingston Dynasty? They became America, and that's the most horrifying truth of all. Marriage wasn't about love in the Livingston Dynasty. It was warfare by another name. Every wedding was a merger, every bride a strategic asset, every child a future pawn in an endless game of accumulation. Robert Livingston the Elder set the template when he married Elida Schuyler van Rensselaer, a widow who brought with her connections to the most powerful Dutch families in New York. It wasn't romance. It was a hostile takeover wrapped in wedding vows. Elida was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely essential to Livingston's success. While Robert played politics and cultivated his piracy connections, Elida ran the actual manor operations with an iron fist. She managed tenant farmers, oversaw production, collected rents, and crushed dissent. Historical records show she was often more feared than her husband, and for good reason. She understood that sentiment was weakness, and mercy was unprofitable. After Robert's death, she kept the empire running for decades, proving that Livingston brutality wasn't gendered, it was familial. But Elida was just the beginning. The Livingstons married into every major colonial family: the Beekmans, the Schuylers, the Van Rensselaers, the Bayards. Each marriage created new networks of power, new access to land, new political leverage. By the 1700s, trying to map Livingston family connections was like trying to untangle a spiderweb that covered the entire colony. And they weaponized their daughters with particular cunning. Livingston women were educated, cultured, trained to be irresistible to ambitious men from other powerful families. When those men married Livingston daughters, they didn't just gain wives, they gained obligations. Suddenly their business interests aligned with Livingston interests. Their political votes supported Livingston causes. Their family wealth became accessible to Livingston schemes. It was soft power exercised through bedrooms and dining rooms, and it was devastatingly effective. But here's the dark undercurrent. Those same Livingston men who carefully arranged strategic marriages for their legitimate children were simultaneously raping enslaved women and producing children they would never acknowledge. The contrast is sickening. White daughters were precious commodities, carefully married off to maximize family advantage. Black daughters born from violence were property, their existence denied, their humanity erased. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was the system working exactly as designed. When the American Revolution erupted, the Livingstons faced an existential crisis. Which side would make them richer? The family split, hedging their bets in the most cynical display of patriotism you've ever seen. Some Livingstons publicly supported independence, not because they believed in liberty, but because they calculated that a new American government would be easier to control than distant British authorities. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston became a founding father, drafted parts of the Declaration of Independence alongside Jefferson, and positioned himself as a revolutionary hero. Meanwhile, his brother John R. Livingston secretly traded with the British throughout the war. Historical records show John conducting illegal commerce with England and its allies, engaging in privateering, essentially piracy with a different flag, because, as he admitted in his own letters, "Poverty is a curse I can't bear." Patriotism took a back seat to profit. The war that killed thousands of ordinary Americans was, for John Livingston, just another business opportunity. He sold supplies to both sides, whichever paid better, and when the revolution succeeded, he wasn't punished. He was rewarded with even more land and property in Manhattan, which he immediately converted into brothels. But the real betrayal was ideological. The Livingstons, who signed revolutionary documents and gave speeches about freedom from tyranny, went home to their feudal manors where tenant farmers lived under oppression worse than British colonial rule. They wrote constitutions guaranteeing property rights while denying those same rights to the thousands of families trapped in perpetual tenancy on Livingston land. They declared all men created equal while holding human beings in bondage and profiting from child prostitution. The revolution changed nothing about Livingston behavior. It just gave them new rhetoric to hide behind. Before 1776, they were colonial landlords. After 1783, they were founding fathers. Same crimes, better branding. And here's what makes it unbearable. It worked. To this day, Robert R. Livingston is celebrated as a patriot. His face appeared on currency. His name adorns schools and streets. The fact that he owned brothels staffed with children gets mentioned, if at all, as a minor historical footnote. The revolution wasn't about freedom. It was about which group of wealthy men would control America. And the Livingstons made sure they'd be on the winning side. There's a story they tell at Claremont State Historic Site about the British burning the Livingston Mansion during the Revolutionary War. It's framed as a tragedy, an act of senseless destruction by the enemy. But what they don't tell you is what was in that house when it burned. What records were destroyed. What evidence turned to ash. In 1777, British forces sailing up the Hudson River deliberately targeted Claremont, the estate of Robert R. Livingston's family. They burned the mansion to the ground, destroying generations of family papers, business records, correspondence, and account books. The official story is that it was retaliation for Livingston's support of the revolution, but some historians have suggested something darker. What if the British were destroying evidence of their own complicity in Livingston crimes? Remember, Robert Livingston the Elder built his fortune through piracy partnerships with British nobles and even the king. Those relationships were documented. Those letters existed. And if they fell into the wrong hands during a revolution, they could destroy not just the Livingstons, but members of British aristocracy who had profited from colonial crime. The fire was convenient, too convenient. It destroyed decades of documentation about land deals, tenant contracts, enslaved people, and business partnerships. When the Livingstons rebuilt Claremont after the war, they controlled the narrative completely. Any uncomfortable questions about the sources of their wealth could be answered with, "The records burned." It's the perfect crime, using war as cover to destroy evidence. And if the British did it intentionally to protect their own nobles who had partnered with the Livingstons, it means even the revolution was theatre, a performance where elites on both sides protected each other while ordinary people died in the crossfire. But here's what survived the fire: the land, the manor system, the tenant farmers, the enslaved people. All the human suffering continued uninterrupted because it existed in bodies, not documents. You can burn papers, but you can't burn memory. The people who lived under Livingston oppression knew the truth. and they passed it down through generations. That's why the anti-rent wars exploded 70 years later, because the stories of injustice survived when the official records didn't. In 1807, Robert Fulton launched the first commercially successful steamboat, the Clermont, named after the Livingston Estate. History books celebrate this as a triumph of American innovation, the beginning of the transportation revolution. What they don't tell you is that it was also one of the most audacious monopoly schemes in American history. Robert R. Livingston, by now Chancellor Livingston, founding father and diplomat, partnered with inventor Robert Fulton not just to build steamboats, but to control all steamboat traffic in New York waters. Through political connections and legal manipulation, they obtained exclusive rights to operate steam-powered vessels on New York rivers for 30 years. Read that again. They owned steamboat transportation. Anyone else who tried to operate a steamboat in New York waters would be violating their monopoly. It was brilliant and absolutely corrupt. Livingston used his political influence to essentially privatize public waterways, turning innovation into extortion. If you wanted to move goods or people via steamboat in New York, you paid the Livingston-Fulton monopoly, or you didn't move at all. For years, they extracted enormous profits from this arrangement, charging whatever prices they wanted because competition was literally illegal. Other inventors and entrepreneurs challenged the monopoly in court repeatedly, and repeatedly the Livingston political machine crushed them. But in 1824, the Supreme Court finally ruled in Gibbons versus Ogden that states couldn't grant monopolies on interstate commerce. The Livingston stranglehold was broken, not because they saw the error of their ways, but because they were legally forced to stop. Yet even in defeat, they won. They'd already made fortunes from the monopoly years, and the Livingston name was now associated with progress and innovation rather than the corruption it actually represented. This pattern repeats constantly in Livingston history. Find something valuable, monopolize it through political connections, extract maximum profit, and when finally forced to stop, move on to the next scheme with reputation somehow intact. It's the aristocratic version of a con game, and they played it for 3 centuries. The steamboat monopoly also reveals how the Livingstons had evolved. Early generations built wealth through piracy and prostitution, direct, brutal crimes. Later generations learned to commit the same theft through legal structures. Why rob a ship when you can monopolize an entire transportation system? Why operate brothels when you can own the buildings and let others take the criminal risk while you collect rent? It's crime laundering, and the Livingstons were masters. There are Livingston descendants who will never inherit anything, who will never see their names in genealogy books, who will never tour the family estates as honored relations. They are the invisible heirs, the children of enslaved mothers, and their story is a holocaust of erasure. Imagine discovering that your ancestor was one of the most powerful families in American history, that your bloodline traces directly to founding fathers and signers of the Declaration of Independence. Now imagine discovering you were excluded from that inheritance because your great-great-great-grandmother was raped by the man who owned her. This is the reality for hundreds, possibly thousands of Black Americans with Livingston ancestry who have been systematically written out of family history. Christopher Rabb's decades-long fight for recognition was just the tip of the iceberg. Genetic testing and genealogical research have revealed numerous other descendants, but the White Livingston Family Association has been glacially slow to acknowledge them. Why? Because acknowledgement means reparations. It means sharing inheritance. It means admitting that the family fortune was built partially on the bodies of enslaved women who were raped with impunity. The legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother, meant that children born to enslaved women were automatically enslaved, regardless of who their father was. Livingston men could rape with absolute impunity because the resulting children weren't heirs, they were property. Those children could be sold, separated from their mothers, worked to death, and the father faced no legal or social consequences. Some Livingston men even sold their own children. Let that horror sink in. A man could rape an enslaved woman, father a child, and then sell that child for profit, and it was completely legal. How many children? We'll never know. The Livingstons didn't keep careful records of enslaved people, and after emancipation many records were deliberately destroyed. Entire family lines were erased from history, but DNA doesn't lie. Modern genetic testing is revealing connections that the Livingstons spent centuries hiding. And each new discovery is another dagger in the mythology of founding father nobility. Because you can't celebrate the Livingston legacy without acknowledging that legacy includes descendants they tried to erase from existence. Every Livingston descendant alive today benefits from wealth accumulated through the enslavement and rape of black women. Every estate, every inheritance, every privileged opportunity traces back to crimes that were never punished. The relationship between the Livingstons and Quaker power in Pennsylvania reveals one of the most disturbing aspects of early American politics: the use of indigenous people as weapons in religious warfare. Quakers presented themselves as pacifists, people of peace who rejected violence. But their pacifism had a convenient exception: violence committed by indigenous peoples against non-Quaker settlers. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, Quaker authorities in Pennsylvania tolerated, and in some cases encouraged, indigenous raids on Presbyterian and other Protestant settlements. Why? Because those settlers were political and religious rivals. They competed for land. They rejected Quaker authority. And if indigenous warriors eliminated them, well, Quaker hands remained clean. Robert Livingston understood this dynamic perfectly. As Secretary for Indian Affairs, he was supposed to prevent indigenous violence against colonial settlers, but he selectively enforced that responsibility. Indigenous raids targeted Quaker enemies, particularly Scots-Irish Presbyterians who had marginalized his family in Scotland. Livingston looked the other way. He even facilitated some attacks by withholding warnings or manipulating intelligence. This was ethnic cleansing by negligence, and it served multiple Livingston interests. First, it kept the Quakers happy, and Quaker happiness meant Quaker political support. Second, it eliminated rivals for land. Settlers who fled or died in indigenous raids left property that could be claimed by people with better political connections, people like the Livingstons. Third, it kept indigenous nations dependent on British mediation, which meant dependent on Robert Livingston personally. The worse the violence became, the more both sides needed him as a go-between. He was indispensable, and he made sure to stay that way. But the strategy eventually backfired spectacularly. In the 1760s, Scots-Irish settlers in Pennsylvania organized as the Paxton Boys and marched on Philadelphia to confront Quaker authorities who had refused to protect them from indigenous raids. The Quakers responded with a propaganda campaign painting the Paxton Boys as racist murderers. But the reality was more complex. These were families who had been abandoned by their government, who had watched their communities destroyed while Quaker authorities did nothing. The Livingston-Quaker alliance had created the conditions for atrocity on all sides. Indigenous peoples were weaponized in colonial power games. Protestant settlers were sacrificed for political convenience. And when violence inevitably spiraled out of control, everyone blamed everyone else, while the architects of the system, families like the Livingstons, remained untouched. The Livingstons didn't just accumulate land and wealth, they captured education, the very institutions that would teach future generations what to think about American history. And what those institutions taught was exactly what the Livingstons wanted them to teach. Members of the Livingston family were deeply involved in founding and funding Columbia University, originally King's College. Philip Livingston and his son Peter were major financial backers, and their family maintained influence over the institution for generations. This wasn't philanthropy, it was narrative control. By funding universities, the Livingstons ensured that history would be written by scholars dependent on Livingston money and access to Livingston archives. Those scholars would naturally emphasize Livingston achievements while downplaying or ignoring Livingston crimes. The same pattern played out with historical societies, libraries, and cultural institutions throughout New York. The Livingstons donated money and papers, served on boards, shaped which stories would be preserved and which would be forgotten. They understood that controlling the past meant controlling the future. If you can determine what documents are archived, what stories are published, what research receives funding, you can engineer your own legacy. And they did. For over 200 years, Livingston family history was told almost exclusively through sources the family controlled. Historians worked from Livingston family papers, donated by Livingston descendants, stored in Livingston-funded institutions. Critical perspectives were rare because critical researchers couldn't access contradictory evidence. It had been destroyed, hidden, or never documented in the first place. This is why the prostitution empire only came to light recently through the work of independent historian Timothy Guilfoyle, who painstakingly reconstructed it from property records and tax documents rather than family archives. The Livingstons hadn't documented their sex trafficking operations in family papers because they didn't want that legacy preserved. But they couldn't hide the real estate transactions, the tax assessments, the legal records of buildings they owned. Evidence survived despite their efforts to bury it. The same is true for the tenant uprisings, the enslaved people, the rapes that produced mixed-race children. These stories survived in court records, newspaper accounts, and the oral histories of descendant communities, sources the Livingstons couldn't control. But even now, even with this evidence available, mainstream historical institutions are slow to integrate it into official narratives. The Livingston influence is so deep that 3 centuries later, it still shapes what stories get told. Walk through Clermont State Historic Site today, and you'll see beautiful architecture, stunning river views, carefully curated gardens. What you won't see are the slave quarters, the tenant-farmer hovels, the physical structures of oppression that made the beauty possible. This is architectural erasure, and it's deliberate. When historic estates are preserved and open to the public, someone decides what to restore and what to demolish. At Clermont and other Livingston properties, the decision was clear. Preserve the manor house, destroy the evidence of suffering. Slave quarters were torn down or left to decay. Tenant-farmer structures were demolished. The physical landscape was sanitized, scrubbed of anything that might complicate the founding father mythology. Modern visitors can admire the craftsmanship of the mansion without being confronted by the hovels where enslaved people slept, or the cramped structures where tenant families lived in poverty. But here's what's truly insidious. The architecture of the manor house itself was designed to intimidate. The Livingstons built their homes to loom over the landscape, visible for miles, a constant reminder of who held power. Tenant farmers working in fields could always see the manor house, a physical manifestation of the authority that controlled their lives. It was psychological warfare through architecture. The same was true of their Manhattan properties. The brothels John R. Livingston controlled weren't anonymous structures. They were concentrated in specific neighborhoods where his ownership was well known. Everyone understood that the Livingston name provided protection, that police wouldn't raid establishments belonging to one of New York's first families. The architecture of power extended beyond individual buildings to urban planning. The Livingstons owned so much Manhattan real estate that they literally shaped how the city developed. Streets were routed to benefit their properties. Infrastructure improvements increased their land values. Zoning decisions protected their investments. This is power at its most fundamental, the ability to shape physical space itself to serve your interests, and the effects persist today. The neighborhoods the Livingstons developed as red light districts still struggle with those legacies. The tenant-farmer regions of the Hudson Valley still bear economic scars from a century and a half of feudal exploitation. The Livingston Manor area remains one of the poorest parts of New York State, while the Livingston descendants who extracted wealth from that region for generations enjoy the accumulated benefits. Geography is history made permanent, and the Livingston geography is one of concentrated wealth, surrounded by deliberately created poverty. The Livingstons didn't just participate in politics, they owned it. For over a century, New York government was essentially a Livingston subsidiary, with family members and allies controlling key positions in what historians call the Livingston faction. This wasn't a political party in the modern sense. It was a patronage network, a spoils system where loyalty to the family was rewarded with appointments, contracts, and opportunities. Cross the Livingstons and your political career died. Support them and doors opened. At one point, in the mid-1700s, Livingston family members simultaneously held positions as Secretary for Indian Affairs, judges on the colonial court, members of the colonial assembly, and controlled relationships with the royal governor. They weren't just in government, they were the government, and they used that power ruthlessly. When tenant farmers tried to organize or protest unfair leases, Livingston judges ruled against them. When rivals challenged Livingston land claims, Livingston politicians blocked them. When laws threatened Livingston interests, Livingston legislators killed them. It was a perfectly closed system of corruption, each piece reinforcing the others. But the true genius was making it look legitimate. The Livingstons mastered the art of legal oppression, using courts, laws, and official processes to commit theft and violence while maintaining a veneer of respectability. They didn't break the law, they wrote the law. And when existing law didn't serve their interests, they changed it. This is how the manor system persisted for so long. It wasn't just custom or tradition, it was backed by law that the Livingstons themselves had crafted. Tenant farmers couldn't challenge the system through legal means because the legal system was designed by their landlords. The only option was violence, which brought down the full force of Livingston political connections. Militia, courts, prisons. The state apparatus became a Livingston enforcement tool. And when the anti-rent wars finally succeeded in reforming the system, it was ent, because the Livingstons lost political power. It was because they calculated that maintaining the manors was worth the political cost. They could make more money through other means, and fighting tenant rebellions was becoming expensive and embarrassing. So they let the manors go and pivoted to new forms of extraction. This is the pattern of elite power. When one form of exploitation becomes untenable, abandon it and move to another. Never actually relinquish power, just change its shape. In 1766, decades before the American Revolution, tenant farmers launched an armed uprising against the Livingstons that nearly destroyed the family. 200 men marched on the manor house demanding freedom from oppressive leases, armed with whatever weapons they could find. This should be celebrated as an American rebellion against tyranny, a preview of the revolutionary spirit. Instead, it's been buried in historical obscurity. Why? Because it was rebellion against the wrong people. The Livingstons couldn't be villains. They were supposed to be patriots. So the 1766 uprising was minimized, dismissed, written out of popular history. But contemporary accounts describe it as serious enough that the Livingstons feared for their lives. They mobilized armed militias, called in favors from colonial authorities, and crushed the rebellion with violence that left tenant farmers dead or imprisoned. Robert Williams, the Chancellor's brother, personally led the suppression forces. There was no mercy, no negotiation. The message was simple: challenge Livingston power and die. But what's fascinating is that some of those same tenants who rebelled in 1766 later fought in the American Revolution. They genuinely believed the rhetoric about liberty and freedom from tyranny. They thought independence from Britain would mean independence from landlords like the Livingstons. They were devastatingly wrong. After the Revolution, the Livingstons strengthened their grip on tenant lands. The new American government protected property rights even more aggressively than the British had. The Founding Fathers who wrote passionately about freedom were also landlords who understood that true freedom would threaten their wealth. So they built a system that guaranteed liberty for people like them and continued oppression for people beneath them. The 1766 rebellion reveals this hypocrisy perfectly. When tenants rebelled against the Livingstons, it was insurrection that must be crushed. When colonists rebelled against Britain, it was glorious revolution. The only difference was who held power afterward. And there were other rebellions, smaller uprisings that never made it into history books. Individual tenant farmers who refused to pay rent and were destroyed for it. Enslaved people who ran away from Livingston properties and were hunted down. Prostitutes who tried to escape the Livingston brothels and were dragged back. Each act of resistance was met with overwhelming violence, and each was then erased from the record. The Livingstons understood that controlling history meant controlling which rebellions are remembered as heroic and which are forgotten as criminal. They made sure theirs fell into the second category. Philip Livingston signed the Declaration of Independence, and that single act has sanitized his entire legacy. Every biography emphasizes his patriotism, his sacrifice, his commitment to American freedom. Almost none mention that he built his fortune as a slave trader, or that he was one of the largest slave owners in New York, or that his investment in human trafficking continued even while he was signing documents declaring all men created equal. This is the double founding father, the public patriot and the private monster, the same man containing both, and somehow history only remembers one half. Philip inherited wealth from his father's piracy and slave trading ventures and expanded both. His ships sailed to Madagascar, the Caribbean, and Virginia, forming the classic triangular trade route. Manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar and tobacco back to New York. The profits were obscene, and they were respectable. Because slavery was legal and slave trading was business, Philip could operate openly, record his transactions in account books, pay taxes on his human cargo, and suffer no social stigma. He wasn't a criminal, he was an entrepreneur. This is what makes founding father mythology so dangerous. We treat the revolution as a moral dividing line, as if signing the Declaration of Independence proved someone's virtue. But Philip Livingston's signature didn't free a single person he enslaved. It didn't stop his ships from trafficking human beings. It didn't prevent him from selling children away from their mothers for profit. He could believe in liberty for white male property owners while simultaneously denying the humanity of black people. And the cognitive dissonance didn't bother him at all. But here's what should haunt every American. Philip Livingston isn't an exception. He's representative. Of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, at least 41 owned enslaved people at some point in their lives. The document proclaiming all men are created equal was signed largely by slave owners. The founding generation's commitment to liberty was always conditional, always limited to people they considered fully human. And families like the Livingstons were experts at drawing those lines to their advantage. Philip Livingston died in 1778, celebrated as a patriot. His widow and children inherited his wealth that came from piracy, slave trading, feudal tenant oppression, and human trafficking. And because he signed one document, history forgave everything else. That's the power of mythology. One heroic act can erase a lifetime of horror if you control who tells the story. Decades before the anti-rent wars exploded into violence, tenant farmers tried peaceful resistance. They organized rent strikes, refusing to pay until the Livingstons agreed to fair leases and the possibility of eventual ownership. The Livingstons' response reveals everything about how power really works in America. They didn't negotiate. They didn't compromise. They used the law as a weapon, taking strike organizers to court. Courts where Livingston family members or allies often presided. Tenant farmers lost every case. They were ordered to pay not just back rent, but penalties and court costs, debts that plunged entire families deeper into poverty. And if they still couldn't pay, the Livingstons seized everything: crops, livestock, tools, even the crude structures tenants had built with their own labor. Families who had worked the same land for generations were evicted, their possessions sold to pay Livingston claims. Where did they go? Into deeper poverty, migrant labor, or they simply disappeared from the historical record. The Livingstons had perfected debt peonage, a system where the rules were designed to make it impossible to escape. Rent was due regardless of crop failure, weather, or economic conditions. If you couldn't pay 1 year, the debt carried over with interest. If you improved the land or built structures, they belonged to the landlord, not you. You could work yourself to exhaustion for decades and end up with nothing but debt to pass to your children. And that was the point. The Livingstons didn't want tenant farmers to succeed and buy their own land. They wanted a permanent underclass of laborers with no choice but to continue working Livingston property. It was slavery with extra steps, and it was completely legal. But what's truly enraging is how this history has been framed. When mentioned at all, the tenant struggles are described as disputes or disagreements, language that suggests both sides had legitimate positions. That's a lie. There was no legitimate position for a system where one family controlled more land than Rhode Island and thousands of families could never own property. It was feudalism, and feudalism is incompatible with American values. except that America's founding families operated feudal systems and nobody stopped them. The rent strikes failed because the legal system was designed by landlords for landlords. The only language power understood was violence, which is why the anti-rent wars eventually turned bloody. When legal resistance is impossible, illegal resistance becomes inevitable. History has been particularly cruel to the women destroyed by the Livingston Dynasty, erasing them twice. First in life, then in memory. The prostituted girls of 5 Points, some as young as 10 years old. The enslaved women raped by Livingston men. The tenant farmers' wives who watched their children starve while the manor house glittered with wealth. These women have no names in historical records, no graves with markers, no memorials. They were consumed by Livingston ambition and then erased from the story. But they existed. They suffered. They matter. In the Livingston brothels of Manhattan, historical records describe a grooming network where older prostitutes recruited younger women, often their own relatives. Mothers groomed daughters. Sisters recruited sisters. This wasn't because they were evil. It was because they were desperate, trapped in a system where prostitution might be the only way to eat. And the Livingstons profited from that desperation, collecting rent while maintaining plausible deniability about what happened in their buildings. For enslaved women on Livingston properties, sexual violence wasn't an exception. It was expected. Masters had complete legal control over the bodies of enslaved women. Resistance could mean death. Pregnancy meant your enslaver owned your child. And if that child's father was your enslaver himself, the child was still enslaved, still property, could still be sold away from you. This is a horror beyond comprehension, yet it was routine on Livingston estates. How many women? How many children? We'll never know exact numbers because the Livingstons didn't keep those records. Enslaved people were documented as property in account books. Age, gender, sometimes skills, never humanity. If a woman was raped and bore a child, there's no notation of who the father was. That information was deliberately suppressed to protect the rapist. For tenant farmer women, life was different, but not better. You worked as hard as your husband, cooking, cleaning, raising children, often doing field work as well. But you had no legal rights. Your husband signed the lease. Your husband answered to the landlord. If the landlord decided to evict your family, you had no say. If your husband died, the lease didn't transfer to you. You could be thrown off land you'd worked for decades. The Livingstons built their empire on the invisible labor of women who received no credit, no compensation, no recognition. And when those women are mentioned in historical records at all, it's as footnotes, brief mentions, names without stories. The Livingstons didn't just exploit existing laws, they invented new ones, pioneering legal techniques that corporations still use today. They were lawyers, judges, and legislators, and they weaponized that knowledge to create structures of oppression that appeared legitimate. Take perpetual leases, the contracts that bound tenant farmers to Livingston land forever. These weren't traditional rental agreements with fixed terms. They were designed to last generations, passing from father to son, debt inherited, along with the obligation to farm land you'd never own. The Livingstons didn't invent feudalism, but they innovated ways to make it legally enforceable in a country that supposedly rejected aristocracy. They added clauses requiring quarter sales, the landlord's right to a percentage of proceeds whenever property changed hands. They included penalties for attempting to alter the lease terms, clauses that made it nearly impossible to negotiate better conditions. They wrote provisions giving landlords first rights to purchase any improvements tenants made, meaning if you built a better barn or cleared new fields, the landlord could buy it from you at a price they determined. It was economic entrapment disguised as contract law. The Livingstons also pioneered the use of shell corporations and complex property arrangements to hide ownership and avoid accountability. When their brothel operations became too notorious, they transferred property to family members or associates, creating layers of legal separation between the Livingston name and the crimes committed in Livingston buildings. Modern corporations use the same techniques. Subsidiaries, holding companies, legal structures that obscure who actually controls what. The Livingstons were doing this in the 1800s, decades before corporate law formalized these practices. In politics, they perfected patronage networks that became the model for political machines throughout American history. Tammany Hall, which would dominate New York City politics in the late 19th century, was essentially copying the Livingston playbook: control appointments, reward loyalty, crush opposition, and maintain power through networks of obligation. And in education and historical preservation, they innovated the use of philanthropic donations to control institutional narratives. By funding universities, libraries, and historical societies, they ensured those institutions would preserve favorable versions of family history. It's reputation laundering, and it's now standard practice for wealthy families trying to rehabilitate their legacies. Every one of these innovations made it harder to challenge concentrated power and easier for dynasties to perpetuate themselves across generations. The Livingstons didn't build their empire alone. They had collaborators, enablers, allies who profited from Livingston crimes and protected Livingston interests. These people have names, families, their own legacies of complicity. Let's talk about them. The judges who consistently ruled in favor of Livingston property claims, even when tenant farmers had legitimate grievances. The sheriffs who enforced evictions, dragging families from homes while knowing those families had nowhere to go. The lawyers who drafted oppressive lease agreements and defended them in court. The politicians who killed legislation that might have reformed the manor system. The newspaper editors who downplayed tenant uprisings and framed the Livingstons as benevolent landlords. The ministers who preached obedience to earthly authority while the Livingstons filled collection plates. Every one of these people made a choice. They could have said no. They could have refused to participate. They could have stood with the powerless instead of the powerful. And they chose power, because power offers rewards, money, position, security, the comfort of being on the winning side. Collaborating with the Livingstons meant your family prospered, your business received favorable contracts, your debts might be forgiven, your children might marry into better families. Opposing the Livingstons meant ruin. They had long memories and absolute commitment to destroying anyone who crossed them. So people collaborated and then justified their collaboration by telling themselves the Livingstons were legitimate. Their wealth was earned. Their power was deserved. It's the psychology of complicity, and it's how every oppressive system maintains itself. There were exceptions. Some judges tried to rule fairly. Some journalists tried to investigate Livingston crimes. Some politicians attempted to introduce reforms. Those people were systematically destroyed. Judges found their rulings overturned by higher courts controlled by Livingston allies. Journalists found their papers strangled financially as advertisers were pressured to withdraw. Politicians lost elections as Livingston money flowed to opponents. The system protected itself by making resistance costly and collaboration profitable. And the collaborators' descendants benefit today. Families that built wealth by serving Livingston interests passed that wealth down through generations. They're doctors, lawyers, business owners now, completely disconnected from the origins of their privilege. They don't think of themselves as beneficiaries of oppression because the connection is too distant. But the line is direct. Their ancestors collaborated with the Livingstons, received rewards, invested that money, and passed it down. Complicity compounds like interest. The Livingstons didn't just erase people from historical records. They erased entire cultures, ways of life that threatened their dominance. This is colonial violence at its most insidious, making people disappear not just physically, but culturally, so thoroughly that future generations don't even know what was lost. Indigenous peoples in the Hudson Valley had complex relationships with the land that the Livingstons completely destroyed. Where indigenous communities saw shared resources and seasonal use rights, the Livingstons saw property that could be owned, sold, and exploited. The imposition of English property law wasn't just a legal change, it was cultural genocide. Suddenly, practices that had sustained communities for centuries were trespassing and poaching. People were criminals for living as their ancestors had lived, and Robert Livingston facilitated this transformation, translating not just languages, but concepts, forcing indigenous worldviews into European legal frameworks that distorted and destroyed them. But it wasn't just indigenous cultures the Livingstons attacked. Tenant farmer communities, developed their own cultures of resistance. Folk songs about landlord oppression, whispered stories of successful rent strikes, traditions of mutual aid that helped families survive impossible conditions. The Livingstons worked to suppress all of it. Songs were discouraged, organizers were arrested, communities were deliberately broken up, with the most troublesome families evicted and scattered. The goal was to prevent collective identity from forming, because collective identity leads to collective action. If tenant farmers thought of themselves as individuals struggling separately, they could be controlled. If they recognized themselves as a class with shared interests, they became dangerous. So the Livingstons promoted competition between tenants, rewarded informants who reported organizing efforts, and punished entire communities for the actions of a few resistors. It was social engineering designed to produce isolation and helplessness. In the prostitution districts, women developed survival cultures, networks of protection, codes for warning each other about dangerous clients, informal systems for caring for the children many of them had. The Livingstons tolerated these only insofar as they kept the women functional. Anything that might help women escape was crushed. And the enslaved people on Livingston properties maintained African cultural practices, passed down languages and traditions and memories of freedom. The Livingstons tried to erase all of it through forced Christianity, punishment for speaking native languages, deliberate separation of people from the same ethnic groups. The goal was to produce people with no identity except enslaved, no connection to anything before bondage, no imagination of anything after. Cultural erasure is genocide in slow motion, and the Livingstons practiced it systematically. In their later years, as the manor system crumbled and public opinion turned against feudal practices, the Livingstons discovered philanthropy. Not the genuine kind that helps people, the reputation-laundering kind that makes monsters look like benefactors. They donated to churches, funded schools, sponsored cultural institutions, and made sure their names were prominently displayed on every gift. This wasn't generosity, it was rebranding. When you've spent 2 centuries accumulating wealth through piracy, slavery, prostitution, and feudal oppression, writing some checks to charity is a cheap price to pay for historical rehabilitation. And it worked. Modern historians routinely describe later Livingstons as philanthropists and public servants, emphasizing their donations while downplaying where the money came from. It's like praising a bank robber for donating part of the stolen money to charity while ignoring the robbery. But Livingston philanthropy had an even darker purpose: social control. By funding schools, they influenced what was taught. By donating to churches, they gained influence over religious authorities who might otherwise criticize their practices. By supporting cultural institutions, they ensured favorable historical treatment. Every donation came with strings attached, subtle or explicit obligations that beneficiaries understood. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. And institutions dependent on Livingston money didn't publish research critical of Livingston history. This is how elite power perpetuates itself through apparent generosity. Philanthropy becomes a tool for controlling discourse, shaping research, and determining which stories get told. And the Livingstons were pioneers of this strategy, developing techniques that modern wealthy families still use. Consider the irony. Claremont State Historic Site exists because Livingston descendants donated the property to New York State. It's celebrated as a generous gift. But the property itself was stolen through piracy, maintained through feudal oppression, and beautified with profits from prostitution and slavery. Donating it doesn't erase those origins. It just makes it harder to criticize them because now the family looks generous. The same pattern appears with historical documents. Livingston descendants donated family papers to libraries and archives, controlling which documents were preserved and which disappeared. They could cull anything embarrassing before donation, ensuring that researchers would only find materials that cast the family in a favorable light. Future historians would work from sources the Livingstons themselves curated, making objective history nearly impossible. False philanthropy is how dynasties achieve immortality. You can't outlive your crimes, but you can try to out-donate them. Modern DNA testing is doing what 3 centuries of historical erasure couldn't prevent. revealing the truth about Livingston bloodlines. And that truth is explosive. Genetic testing has confirmed dozens, possibly hundreds of African American families with direct Livingston ancestry. Descendants of enslaved women raped by Livingston men. Each positive DNA test is another nail in the coffin of founding father mythology. Undeniable scientific proof that the Livingstons didn't just own enslaved people, they raped them and then denied the resulting children any acknowledgement or inheritance. Christopher Rabb's genealogical research paved the way, but DNA doesn't require documents that can be destroyed or disputed. It's written in our cells, passed down through generations, impossible to erase. And as more people test, more connections appear. The Livingston descendants who gather at family reunions and tour Claremont as honored inheritors are being confronted by relatives they never knew existed, relatives who share their DNA but were deliberately excluded from the family narrative. Some white Livingston descendants have responded with grace, acknowledging these connections and advocating for recognition. Others have resisted, uncomfortable with what genetic truth reveals about their ancestors and themselves. Because accepting these black relatives means accepting that the Livingston fortune was built partially on sexual violence, that every inheritance includes compensation for rape. But DNA is also revealing uncomfortable truths about other founding families. The Jeffersons, the Hemmingses, that story is well known now, but testing is uncovering similar patterns across the founding generation. It turns out that founding fathers frequently meant founding two families, the acknowledged white one and the denied black one, and the genetic evidence is irrefutable. What this means is that American aristocracy, the descendants of founding families who still occupy positions of wealth and power, includes thousands of black Americans who have been systematically excluded from inheritance, opportunity, and recognition. It's a massive theft, compounded over generations, and DNA testing is finally providing the evidence to prove it. Some genetic descendants are pursuing legal claims, arguing they're entitled to a share of family wealth accumulated through the labor and bodies of their enslaved ancestors. These lawsuits face enormous legal obstacles. How do you calculate inheritance denied for 200 years? How do you quantify the compounding losses when someone is excluded from family wealth? But the fact that these claims are even being filed represents a reckoning the Livingstons never anticipated. They thought they'd gotten away with it, that time and erasure had protected them. DNA is proving them wrong,